Which under the radar training camp battles are going to have a big impact on the Falcons 2024 season?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may know me as Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And of course, I thank each and every one of you that tunes in each and every day, especially those of you that tune in during this time of year. I know this, the numbers tell me that this is not the most popular episodes that we do during the last week of June and the first few weeks of July. And so I really do appreciate those of you that even in this downtime are everydayers of this pod that make it your first listen, your first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer so that you can be appreciated in my heart is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are talking about under the radar position battles heading into training camp. We always tend to focus on the sort of the big competitions for starting spots, like at corner and safety, which we've touched upon, many times already this summer. We'll probably continue to touch upon them in the next, 3 weeks between now and the start of training camp as well. But I wanted to talk about some positions that I think are sort of going under the radar that are going to probably matter a little bit more this upcoming season than probably a lot of people assume. And the first one I want to talk about is along the defensive line. I think one of the intriguing things that I'm looking forward to this training camp for the Falcons is how the sort of D-line rotation works out. And I think one of the key position battles is that for that nose tackle position. When we go back to last year when Ryan Nielsen was running the defense, he was a big fan of having a deep rotation. The Falcons were playing 9 or more guys along their defensive front most games last season. And when you contrast that with Raheem Morris, that was not something that they did regularly in LA, right? The last 3 years, right? The majority of the last 3 years, they've kind of had like 7 core guys that they played, and they would get like a little sprinkling of an 8th or 9th guy that was on the active roster, but those guys would barely play, right? You go back to last year, they had 5 D linemen and 2 edge rushers that played the vast majority of the snaps. The 2022 season, you had 4 D linemen and 3 edge rushers. 2021, they were a little deeper, I think in part due to adding someone like a Von Miller in the middle of the season, and they had 8 guys in the rotation, 4 D linemen, 4 edges. That potentially could have been 9 if Sebastian Joseph Day would have been healthy, in the second half of the season. But, I'll be curious to see if this year, in Atlanta, Morris is willing to go with a deeper 8 or more guy, right? Rotation on the defensive front, looking at the interior D-line as well as the edge rushers is what we're talking about. And I think I'm confident that we'll get at least 5 D linemen that are regularly playing. Maybe we'll see 6. This is where sort of, if you heard me talk about this a couple of weeks ago with Brandon Dorlus, where I was like, I'm not convinced he's going to play a whole lot because I'm sort of expecting that 6 D lineman to sort of barely play this year. And that's where I sort of pigeonhole Dorlus at this point in time. I feel like we'll get at least 3 edge rushers that are going to play. I don't think we're going to see like it was last year in LA with Michael Hoyt and Byron Young playing pretty much all the snaps with Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter. I think Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter are locks to be 2 out of the 3, maybe 4 guys that we see at the edge rusher rotation position. But that 3rd or 4th guy, to me, is kind of a toss-up between Braylon Trice and D'Angelo Malone and James Smith-Williams and Bradley Anae, who sort of emerges over the course of the summer. But those 5 core D linemen, I think, are going to be Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, Ruka Roro, and the 5th one, I think, is going to be the winner of this nose tackle competition. And then that 6th guy, to me, again, is probably Brandon Dorlus, but, Kentavious Street, Taquan Graham, I think are going to be in the mix. But I think there's a 3-way competition at the nose tackle spot, right? You have LaCale London, you have Eddie Goldman, you have Zion Logue, and I think the winner is going to have a significant role in the Falcons base defense. I've been penciling in LaCale London as the winner, the eventual winner of that spot, just because I'm assuming that, we're not going to get a third time's a charm with Eddie Goldman saying like, I'm going to play for the Falcons this year, and then deciding like, I'm not going to play for the Falcons this year. So maybe we get a change now that Jay Rodgers is here, who coached Eddie Goldman in Chicago for several years. Maybe he can convince Eddie to at least, show up to training camp. We really haven't had that really at all. I think technically he did show up last summer. He just didn't practice, so we'll see on that. But, I think Zion Logue is probably the long-term answer in this role at nose tackle, but right now I'm kind of expecting him to play the practice squad. We'll get more into Zion Logue hopefully next week when we do the full breakdown. I think he definitely has a chance to make the 53-man roster, but currently I'm sort of projecting him for the practice squad, but we'll see on that front. But, the other thing I'm wondering about that's, tangentially related to this nose tackle position is, is the Falcons solution at nose tackle, is it, gum in the form of one Grady Jarrett, right? Do we see Grady Jarrett continue to get some of these, nose tackle snaps at the one technique position? Because I know a lot of people sort of assume, Grady Jarrett's going to be the Aaron Donald of the Falcons defense, sort of taking those sort of cookie cutter spots from the Rams unit. And Grady's background actually is more of a one-tech nose tackle that makes him probably better suited to be the Greg Gaines or Sebastian Joseph Day, who were the Rams nose tackles primarily from 2019 to 2021, rather than Aaron Donald playing a lot more of that one technique spot. And that's something that Grady Jarrett has majored in throughout his career, is playing more of that one technique spot than I think a lot of folks give him credit, because they just sort of naturally see him as a 3-tech. And I sort of imagine David Onyemata might be more of the sort of 3-tech that takes the quote unquote Aaron Donald role. And then you have Zach Harrison potentially as the front runner for the 5 technique role in their 3-man base unit, possibly Ruka Roro sort of pushing him. And, I think with that 3-man, D-line in your 3-4 base, or, we talked about it yesterday on the podcast with the 5-1 penny front in your nickel, and for those of you that don't know, like basically that 3-man unit, you're going to have one DN as a 5-tech, one as a 1-tech, and one as a 3-tech. Again, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's a simple way of looking at it. And those of you that don't know what the techniques stand for, 5 technique means that you line up over the tackle's outside shoulder. 3 technique means you line up over the guard's outside shoulder. 1 tech means you line up over the centers. And the even techniques, 0, 2, and 4, line up directly over the player. So 0 is a center, 2 is the guard, 4 is the tackle. So, all off season long, I've been sort of assuming that we're going to have sort of a base group of guys that play in the base defense, so that the Falcons can save guys like Onyemata and Grady for those nickel snaps. And sort of, I've been making the assumption that, we'll play a classic sort of nickel front, which is that 2-4 front, as opposed to the 5-1 penny front. And so maybe I need to incorporate a little bit more of that. And typically, because of that assumption, I don't really focus too much on techniques when it comes to nickel situations, because it doesn't matter as much, because you're trying to get guys in advantageous situations as a pass rusher. And techniques are really more about being in your right gap when it comes to defending the run. Now, obviously teams do run, the ball when defenses are in nickel, but you're just not as worried about it. So it's not as much of a priority. So tend not to focus on that sort of thing. But one does wonder if, especially in a world where the Falcons use their penny front, in their nickel, who's going to, be playing a lot more of that one technique stuff, because the goal of that penny front is to basically try to maximize your ability to defend the run while also being in a nickel that is meant to defend the pass, right? It's like trying to maximize your front's ability to stuff the run, especially against the outside zone run scheme. That's kind of the goal of the penny front. Go listen to yesterday's episode to get more insight into that. But, I'm wondering, sort of if Grady Jarrett's going to get significant snaps playing one technique this year. And maybe that's Onyemata. But again, I think because Grady Jarrett has spent a large chunk of the last decade playing that role, it makes total sense for him to continue to play that role. But a lot of that may depend on how confident this team is coming out of training camp, and whoever wins that nose tackle battle in that three-way competition that we're talking about. And, if they're only looking for a guy to come in and spell Grady for 15 snaps a game, like, I feel pretty confident that someone like a Laquale London, who basically did that last year, can do that role again this year. If they're looking for a little bit more for that guy so that they can save Grady from doing some of that stuff, then, we'll have to sort of see whether or not a guy like London or Eddie Goldman or Zion Logue is capable of doing that. So to me, how the rotation overall is pretty fascinating to me to see how it all shakes out, and sort of specifically at that nose tackle position, because you could argue that it's technically a starting spot, especially if it's part of the base defense. But we'll sort of see how that goes. And, I know there's some people that think Zach Harrison's going to play more of an edge rusher role. And while I think Zach Harrison will be a functional edge, to me, similar to the conversation we had yesterday when we were talking about the penny fronts with, Caden Ellis potentially moving to outside linebacker. If Zach Harrison and or Caden Ellis are getting significant snaps as full-time edge rushers or outside linebackers, that to me would be a huge indictment of the Falcons' quality of outside linebackers, right? That, they're looking at those guys as functional pieces, as an upgrade to what they have, but we'll see on that front. But, I'm assuming at this point in time that they're going to keep 7 D linemen. I think that 7th guy is probably going to be inactive a lot of games. The 6th guy may not play a ton. And again, that's where I'm sort of expecting Brandon Dolis to kind of slot in. And that 5th guy, I think, is probably going to be that nose tackle, whoever wins that competition in training camp. And between London, Goldman, and Logue, if one or more of those guys has a strong camp, then, that may lead to them having a bigger role in the rotation. And the reason why that matters is because that could potentially influence how Grady Jarrett and to a lesser extent David Onyemata are used this year. And given that we're expecting those guys to kind of be the primary drivers or catalysts to this pass rush, whatever this pass rush winds up being, that's going to potentially matter. So I do think this nose tackle position is one of those under the radar spots. Our next under the radar spot that I think is worth talking about comes on special teams, where we have 2 potential candidates to take over for the return duties, and whether we'll discuss as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, whether or not McCloud or Avery Williams will win that battle, or will, both of them have a role on the return units this year. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So now that it is the middle of summer, we're looking at baseball, right? The Braves getting back in the groove, and now it's perfect time, if you want to go down to the ballpark. And, Game Time is allowing you to be spontaneous, because Game Time allows you to save money, last minute tickets. That's what Game Time specializes in. You just you open up the app on your phone, and you're just like, hey, I'm bored, oh, the Braves are playing. Well, let me go see. Let's check it out. And you can shop their flash deals. That's, allows you to save on exclusive in-app purchases. All-in prices mean you don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout. And of course, what you see is what you get with their views from your seat. So you can line up perfectly, where you're going to sit to catch that, random foul ball or whatever. So whether you're in the baseball, other sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. All you got to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Guys, don't forget to check out Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels. That part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, if you're an everydayer of this podcast, I love talking about special teams, right? It's one of the rare times I ever get excited on this podcast, where, I thrust off the Mr. Drew moniker, that negative Nancy, and we can talk about special teams. So, if you see me smiling, that's why we're getting to talk about special teams today on the podcast. And, the Falcons have 2 proven options in terms of the return game, and McCloud and Avery Williams. And usually we know that teams don't carry one. So it's sort of the assumption is, only one of these guys is going to stick. But the Falcons might be unusual this year. Now, you may recall, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, when I did my 53-man roster projection, I left Avery Williams off of it. And that was just me forgetting about Avery Williams. That wasn't necessarily an indicator of that. But understandably, if you look at the timeline of this offseason, you could understand why even if I wasn't making that mistake, would have considered Avery Williams a bubble player on the outside looking in because, we start at the beginning of the offseason. It looked like, okay, Avery Williams is safe because the Falcons retained Marquise Williams as their special teams coordinator. We know when have these turnovers at coaching staff, you hire a new special teams coordinator. He's like, well, I want to bring in my own guys, right? And with Williams being retained, that wasn't going to be the case. And so it seemed like in February, at least, Avery Williams was going to be back as the return specialist coming off the injury, the ACL tear that caused him to miss all of 2023. But then we get to March, and then the Falcons spend a decent amount of change on Ray McCloud in free agency, signing him to a 2-year, $5 million deal, $2 million guaranteed this year. And then we get to April, and the Falcons draft an RB3 in Jace McCullough, who we'll probably be talking about on tomorrow's episode. And so, even if I wasn't forgetting him, it would have been easy for me to kind of assume that Avery Williams, was potentially on a bubble because they brought in two players to do basically the exact job that he did back in 2022 when he was healthy. And so you consider that, McCloud's making a decent amount of money, that he would be the front runner to be both the kickoff and punt returner, given his experience there. But there's also a possibility that Ray McCloud might be in the mix to start at wide receiver 3 this year, right? He could be in a competition to sort of be Zach Robinson's preferred gadget guy, which is probably what that wide receiver 3 is going to be with Rondale Moore. I'd still pencil Moore in as the front runner at that spot, but, we'll see what happens in training camp. But, when you look at these two guys, Ray McCloud and Avery Williams, like, historically speaking, as return specialist, McCloud has been the more effective kickoff returner, while Williams has been the more effective punt returner. And so it's like, why not use both of these guys rather than one of these guys, sticking on the roster? Why not use both? And every dayers over the past 3 years know that we haven't really spent any time talking about kickoffs, whether we're talking about coverage units or return units, because they've basically been non-existent in the league. They don't really matter all that much. But, with the new kickoff rules, they're back. And with the Falcons paying a small premium for Ray McCloud, it makes a little bit more sense with that in mind, not to mention the potential value he may bring on offense should he carve out a role there. But when it comes to splitting duties, I think the one benefit, if they do wind up doing that, it could allow Avery Williams to be a regular on coverage units. That's a place where he's been kind of a part-time player back in 21 and 2022, because the Falcons didn't want to risk, injury risk because he was their return guy. But, he has had experience working as a gunner and personal protector on punt team. And he's been very good in both roles. I remember that forced fumble he had against the Bills back in 21, his rookie season. And he's also been sort of the L5 or R5 guy on kickoff coverage units, which is usually reserved for your best coverage guys. And those are the spots that line up right next to the kicker. And theoretically, because they have the shortest path down the field to covering the kick, assuming it goes straight or whatnot. So, he's a very good coverage guy that we haven't really been able to fully tap into that ability over his first 2 seasons. And now maybe the addition of Ray McCloud and taking some of that load off of him as a kickoff returner potentially, will allow the Falcons to fully tap into not only Avery Williams' punt return abilities, but also his coverage abilities. So that is something I'm potentially looking forward to. But while I sit here and I talk about both of those guys potentially having a role this year, it's still going to be a battle, right? They're still going to let both of those guys get opportunities, and one or more of those guys could come out and kill it in training camp and be like, well, I think, like if Ray McCloud, who we're assuming is going to be the kickoff guy, if he takes a punt to the house, in preseason, then it's like, okay, well, maybe he should be the punt return guy too. Or Avery Williams winds up, getting a 60-yard play on a kickoff return or something like that. You might flip it, or you might say one of those guys should hold both jobs. So that is going to be something to keep an eye on. And the reason why it matters is because of field position, right? Sometimes field position can be overrated. I recall back in 2017, people tried to argue that the reason why the Falcons offense took a big step back under Steve Sarkisian was because they were I think they finished 31st in the league in average starting field position. They're like, that's the reason that our offense isn't scoring as much. And it was like, no, that's not the reason. There's a lot other reasons, but that's where field position tends to be overrated, because people just will look at your rankings and say like, oh, you're 29th in average starting field position. That means, it's really hurting your team. And it's like, it doesn't really work that way. But we do know that field position can help your ability on offense or hurt your ability on offense. We're not going to get into a deep dive on how the new kickoff rules are going to impact that. That's probably a conversation we'll save to August, maybe until we get to the preseason, so we can kind of see how it works in action before we try to spend too much time speculating. But maybe we'll get into it earlier than that. But I think what the new kickoff rules are going to do, how they affect field position, exactly we don't know. But I think it's going to make field position a lot less predictable, right? In the past several years, it's been like, okay, pretty much every single series you're going to start at your 25 and that's it. And this year there's going to be plenty of opportunities for you to start inside your 15, inside, at the 25, at the 35 or whatever. And that sort of level of variance is going to potentially have major impact on football games this year. Now, we're hoping that the Falcons offense is good enough, which is, going back to the 2017 point, our Falcons offense is good enough that it doesn't really matter if they start, wherever they start, they'll be able to move the ball effectively, which is what the people that were arguing about the field position in 2017 weren't realizing. Like, even when the Falcons did have bad field position, they were pretty effective at moving the ball down the field. Their problem was like they weren't punching the ball in the end zone to the degree that they needed to. But, it'll be interesting to sort of see how that impacts it. So we're hoping the offense can overcome whatever field position issues, this team may deal with. But, we're not as confident about the defense, right? So it's like, that could mean a whole lot. And again, if you can bolster your defensive field position because Avery Williams is out there covering kicks and whatnot, that would help. So we'll see how it all plays. It's just the idea of like, field position can kind of swing things. Like, it means that you have to make one more first down than you normally would, or one less first down than you normally would. And those things could matter, right? Especially if, you're having a rough day on offense or a rough day on defense or whatnot. And so I think that's going to be something that's interesting to pay out. So that's why, to me, the return specialist battle is going to matter, because it's going to potentially impact field position, and those types of things could have a dramatic impact. I can't remember the specific game, but I remember there was a game last year where the Falcons really struggled with their starting field position, and that was an issue for them because their offense was not as good at moving the ball as we would want it to be. So I'll have to go back after I record this episode and look up what game that was and maybe leave it in the comments. But, if you think me talking about special teams is, just for me, then you're wrong, because the next under the radar position battle is really the only position. I feel like I'm the only person that cares about this, right? I'm the only person that's invested in this, and that's the backup guard spot. And basically, who's going to be the eighth man in the offensive line rotation. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So if you don't know, on game days, teams tend to carry 8 offensive linemen on their active 48-man roster. That includes the 5 starters and 3 backups. You got your swing tackle, you got your utility interior lineman, and then it's kind of whatever we need, right? Sometimes that 8th guy is a second tackle, sometimes that's another interior player. And we kind of know who the top 7 guys are probably going to be for the Falcons. We know who the 5 starters on their O-line are going to be. We kind of know who the top 2 backups are. The swing tackle is going to be Storm Norton. That utility interior offensive lineman is very likely to be Ryan Nuzul. We'll see if someone can push him this summer. Maybe Javon Gwynn can push him for that role. But, those guys performed reasonably well, right? Norton and Nuzul, when they were forced to step into lineups for an extended period of time. Norton for 5 games, Nuzul for 4 games, they were good. But then the other guys, whether we're looking at Tyler Vrabel for the 1 game he had to play, or Kyle Hinton for the 1 game he had to play, it wasn't quite as good as we would like it to be. And, we talk about, I think I did a Q&A last month where a listener asked me about the offensive line depth, and I basically mentioned how I was a little disappointed the Falcons didn't try to upgrade the guard position this year, just because of, the underwhelming performance of Kyle Hinton for that 1 game he was forced to start for Chris Lindstrom last year. And I think, Hinton is still the incumbent just because he had that role last year, but I think it's going to be a wide open competition, to push for that 8th offensive lineman to be that last active player on the O-line on game day. I think Nuzul can play guard in a pinch, but I don't think that's his ideal role. And so you want to have someone that you can trust if and when, Chris Lindstrom or Matthew Bergeron go down potentially this year. You want to have someone that you can trust to step into that role. And I think it's quietly a need, right? Every dayers know from last year, we spent a lot of time last summer talking about the open concerns at swing tackle, right? We talked more about swing tackle last summer than we talked about the quarterback position. Now, again, that to me was because we understood that we weren't going to learn anything about the quarterback during training camp and preseason, and we needed to just basically see him play against real defenses in the NFL to figure out what he was. So, all the talk of what he looked like in practice and whatnot to me was a waste of time. And basically what I'm sitting here saying is backup guard is going to be that position for me this year. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about. Now, we will talk about Penix, right? But, while everybody else is obsessed with Penix, I'm going to be like, but did you see Javon Gwyn though? But, we'll see how that goes. But, I think it's going to be another summer where we talk, or at least on this podcast, we spend a lot of time talking about the backup offensive line, because basically there's a 90% probability that one or more of these backups are going to be forced into the line. And that number comes from the fact that over the last 26 seasons, the Falcons have only had 3 of those seasons where they had the same starting 5 start every single game. And basically, as a longtime Falcon fan and really a longtime football fan, you just see it all around the league. You constantly see teams' seasons get tanked because they don't have good enough O-line depth. That can really tank your season so quick. Ask the New York Giants. That's basically been the Giants in the post-Eli, Tom Coughlin era. It's just their offensive line just keeps tanking their season. The Jets are a similar team. Right? Those New York teams, they just can't get right on the offensive line. But, as I mentioned earlier, we saw several backups play it last year, and I think shoring up the interior this year is going to matter, right? Especially when you look at some of the D tackles that the Falcons are going to face this year. It's, it's almost every week, right? It's almost every week. It's like there's like 3 games off where you're like, oh, we don't have to worry about the D tackles that we're facing this week. It's like 3 of those games this entire season. Every other game, it seems like you got some all-pro or near all-pro type of player that you're going to have to block. And, given who we have at the quarterback position, I think having adequate interior line play is going to matter. And I mean that because, how you build your offensive line is, to me, based off of who your quarterback is. If you have a pocket passer like we do, you kind of want to strengthen your interior because those guys typically are more negatively impacted by interior pressure. While if you have a more athletic, mobile quarterback that's going to, extend plays and roll to his right or roll to his left, outside the pocket, then, having really good tackles is probably going to matter a little bit more. And, when we look at Penix long-term, I know many are concerned about the right tackle position because that's going to be Penix's blind side. I'm not as concerned about that, not because I think Caleb McGarry is the solution to that problem, but just because I think Penix's play style means that it's going to be more important to have a stronger interior. And if you go back and watch the Michigan game in the national championship game, you'll see how much interior pressure really kind of hurt him in that game because Michigan's D tackles were just killing Washington's guards in that game. But that's more of obviously a 2026 conversation than a 2024 conversation. But I think it still sort of applies to Kirk Cousins in the short term, in the immediate future, where you want to shore up that interior. And while we feel good about the starters, do we feel good about the backups, right? Because you don't want to be in a position late in the season where the Falcons are in must-win games where they have to win these games down the stretch to make the playoffs. And you just look at some of the D tackles they're going to face in those the last month of the season, right? You got Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence, Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne in Washington, Derek Brown in Carolina. And if you don't have if one of those guys, you're whoever's replacing one of your starters or whatever, and he's a liability, like they're just going to put that guy on that guy and they're just going to feast on this offensive line all game long. And that's going to obviously have, problems and, potentially cause, the Falcons to miss the playoffs. So when we talk about this guard competition, like, again, it's probably Kyle Hinton, it's probably Javon Gwyn, again, penciling in Javon Gwyn as the front runner for that spot. But if you recall last year when we broke down Javon Gwyn's film, from college, I didn't love him as a guard. To me, much like Brian Nuzzo, he projects much better as a center that will kind of hide some of the athletic limitations that he has and physical limitations that he has. But, maybe he makes that jump in year 2 and can be functional. Maybe Kyle Hinton with a second year under Dwayne Ledford can make a significant jump. We'll see if those guys are in the mix. John LeGlue also has some experience playing guard. Andrew Stuber has some experience playing guard. The undrafted free agent Ryan Cole has some experience playing guard. So we'll see if any of those guys emerge in the mix, or if we're at the end of August, in 6-7 weeks or whatever, 8 weeks from now, and I'm sitting here watching other teams' preseason games because I'm trying to scout, some bubble player that we could pick up at the guard position, like I basically spent all of last August, looking for tackles. So, Our Dwayne Ledford stock took a little bit of a hit last year, but we're hoping, buy it back low and he'll be able to get those guys up to speed. But that is, to me, an open question mark. And I think that could have significant ramifications for the season if you have, a problem, if you don't have adequate offensive line depth. So we'll see how that goes. Tomorrow's episode, we should be getting into Jace McClellan, our full breakdown of him. So make sure you check us out as your first listen. For those of you that are everydayers, make sure you subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.